It's the perennial question that plagues PC gamers. How much money should you be spending on your GPU? Should you dump all the ducats into your GPU or should you have a more balanced system? Welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. We're going to take a look at when it makes sense to overinvest in your GPU and when does it make sense to invest just a little bit more in your CPU platform. We'll take a look at the Ryzen X3D CPUs. How much should those things be going for right now, especially with this 7700 X3D on the horizon? And is AM5 finally worth it for budget gamers? This is our July Q&A part 2. If you get value out of this video, please give it a like. Of course, subscribe for more cool PC content. Let's jump into it. How much should you spend on your graphics card on your next PC build or your next PC upgrade? That's always one of the big questions for gamers. F-Art wants to know, from a pure gaming perspective, at what price will purchasing a 9070 over a 9070 XT make sense? What about an RTX 5070 versus 5070 Ti relative to that 9070 and 9070 XT? Well, let's take a look here. I just went ahead and looked at our recent GPU market update. I will leave the full video link down in the video description. I've just turned off all the used GPUs and we're just looking at brand new GPUs capable of 240Hz, 1440p. That means they've got 12 gigs or more of VRAM and they're at least 100 or more average FPS. Remember that these are wide benchmarks. They take into account harder to run single player titles in more lightweight games or competitive games like CS2, Battlefield 6, Arc Raiders, those kinds of titles. You should get tons and tons of frames on more basic competitive settings. And let's just jump into price to performance here. The 9070 GRE is probably the lowest end GPU I would consider for like kind of these higher end esports titles at 1440p. $499 right now. You can pick that up over at Newegg. There's one model that's on discount there, and you get about 100 average FPS. Remember, again, this is across a wide benchmark, so obviously much higher on competitive titles. If you wanted about 20% more performance, you could spend about another $70 and get the 9070 there. You get about 120 average FPS at 1440p. Meanwhile, if you look at the 9070 XT, you jump up about 13% there, or actually, I guess it would be about 10% over the 9070. So you get 133 average FPS, but now you're at like $680, $690, depending on sales, recently as low as $549 below MSRP, but more likely like $649 on a sale. On the NVIDIA side, RTX 5070, right now $599. I have seen some models drop at $569. They sold out pretty quickly, but somewhere in that just under $600 price point, you get about 100 average FPS. It's not that much more than the 9070 GRE for another $100. It is kind of hard to justify. And of course, the 5070 Ti right now, you can pick a couple of models up, $899 to about like $910. I'll link all these down in the video description, the best deals I can find on them, by the way. But let's say $900 kind of best price for about the same performance as the 9070 XT. So then what are we spending here? We're spending $200 more on the 5070 Ti than we did on the 9070 XT, right? And we're spending $100 more, or roughly, on the 9070 XT than we were on the 9070. And we're spending $70 from the 9070 to the 9070 GRE. And what do we get? We basically get 33% additional FPS for all of that additional money spent. So anywhere from $500 up to $679, that's about $180 we're going to spend to get 33% more performance. It's not a terrible deal. And you can see the price of performance there does get worse as we go up, but it's always gotten worse as we've gone up. It's always been the case that the more mid-range GPUs are typically the best price to performance. And then if you want additional performance over and above the mid-range, you are going to pay a little bit of a price premium. Now, it's always been that way, but what's one of the limiting factors right now? VRAM. And this is until we get an RTX 50 Super series that might put a 5070 Super 18 gigabyte GPU on the table for more like $649 out there. That would certainly be more interesting. And you can see with this slight overclock, it might start to approach the 9070 and have 18 gigs of VRAM. And I think NVIDIA would probably be happy to sell that as a 9070/9070 XT kind of competitor out there. But I did a whole other video on that, so you can check that one out. So really where I'm at with this is if you want that extra performance, if you feel like you're gonna get the difference out of that performance and you've got the budget for it, that's where I would spend most of my money. And then I would get whatever CPU platform just basically doesn't overly bottleneck it. I wouldn't really probably be looking at AM4 for any of these CPUs unless I had a 5800 X3D. Definitely for a new build, I'd be looking at a Ryzen 7600 kind of AM5-ish build at a minimum. But you could look at the 7600 X3D, which is like $230, $240 right now, and you get tons and tons of FPS out of that. Again, this is why I would be investing most of my money in the GPU. But what about price to performance for X3D CPUs? There's so many freaking X3D CPUs. In fact, we're just about to get a 7700 X3D relatively soon. GM Berserker wants to know what should be a good price difference between the 7800 X3D, the 9800 X3D, and the 9850 X3D to make it worth the upgrade. So for those of you out there, maybe you're on like a Ryzen 7600X, 9600X, at what point should you start to consider upgrading your CPU as well? Well, let's take a look at the benchmarks that TechSpot did recently with an RTX 5090 on pretty much every X3D CPU in existence that's the Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7 CPU. And you can see, skipping the AM4 stuff, although you could look at the 5800 X3D, for instance, 188 average FPS. Look at that, the 7600 X3D, which right now is going for like $240. You get quite a bit of an increase there at 1080p medium. But let's look at 1080p very high. The difference is less, but again, if you've got a higher end GPU, an RTX 4090, an RTX 5080, and you're sitting on a 5800 X3D that maybe you upgraded a couple years ago, yeah, even a 7600 X3D would basically smoke the 5800 X3D at this point. The 5800 X3D is roughly equivalent to between a Ryzen 7600X and a 9600X. 9600X slightly faster, 7600X slightly slower than the 5800 X3D, but again, very, very similar. Even a 7500 X3D would be a noticeable uptick. But then what about the 7800 X3D, the 9800 X3D, and the 9850 X3D? Because you do get substantially more FPS, although again, RTX 5090 at 1080p, as you come down in GPU power, I mean, the 5080 is an immediate step down from the 5090. 5070 Ti, similarly, again, step down. A 5070, big step down. And of course, if you're buying the GPU and the CPU at the same time, you've got to kind of make a trade-off between budget, unless you're just got all the money in the world and then just buy the 9850 X3D and RTX 5090. And I don't even know why you're asking me this question. So obviously, because we've got a budget in real time, we've got to figure out how best to spend our money. If we take a look right now, this is PC Part Picker. I've got every X3D currently on the market here, from the 7600 X3D at $240, and 7500 X3D. Nice to see it coming down in price, by the way. It was $300, now it's $279 in the US. Still needs to catch up to the 7600 X3D, but I know in some other markets, it's actually the better price CPU. 7800 X3D right now is $375. The 7700 X3D is going to be $329, which is going to be right here, which is where the 5700 X3D is basically. So we're expecting that to kind of slot in right there. It's still about $90 more than the 7600 X3D. So just jumping back into the data here, I mean, is this jump between 213 at, well, actually, let's look at 181 average FPS to 196 average FPS. It's about a 10% jump, just roughly, a little bit less than 10%. Is a 10% jump with an RTX 5090 really worth the additional extra $90? Well, if you could take that $90 and move from a 5070 to a 5070 Ti or 5070 to a 9070 XT, maybe that makes some sense. Otherwise, yeah, maybe going up to the 7800 X3D might help us out in terms of FPS. But again, remember, this is where we're CPU bottlenecked. We may be GPU bottlenecked at those lower end GPUs. Then in terms of the 9800 X3D and the 9850 X3D, it's frames, basically a couple of frames. So really, if we take a look at the pricing down here, $489 to $434, to me, the 9800 X3D is standout. And if you want to save the money, but I could see people saying, I just want to get the biggest, fastest, because it is possible that with a 6090 in the future that we'll see more headroom out of the 9850 X3D. I don't think that that's the case, but I could see somebody trying to make an argument there because the 5090 maybe isn't fast enough, doesn't have a big enough CPU bottleneck. And so that's kind of its limitation. So for an extra $50, it is harder to justify the 9850 X3D, seeing as you get very little performance out of it. But where would I go here in terms of pricing? Well, honestly, the 7600 X3D kind of throws everything out of whack because it is so insanely priced for the value. And we've got a 7600 X3D build guide, by the way, on the channel. You can check it out. You can use a budget tower air cooler for that thing. It's really, really crazy. Same with the 7500 X3D in your market, if that was the better priced one, or you don't have access to the 7600 X3D like we do in the US now and some other parts of Europe. But what would I say needs to be the pricing for the 7800 X3D? I mean, I think the 7700 X3D is the answer to that. It should be no more than $330, and I would love to see it closer to $299. I think that's in a really appropriate price, given you've got the 7600 X3D right there. I know there are always going to be people who want those 2 extra cores, regardless of any additional gaming performance to it, because it's entirely possible the 7600 X3D games just like the 7700 X3D. And I've already told AMD that, hey, I think the price needs to be a little bit lower than you've already said. So then for the rest of these, the 9800 X3D, I like the price. I think the 9850 X3D honestly needs to come down a little bit. I love the 9800 X3D to start slotting in like $399. Especially as we get towards the end of the year and we start thinking about like Nova Lake X3D. All right, Suzita wants to know, is buying an SSD worth it now or should they wait for better prices? It's their first time building a gaming PC. Well, I think here's a couple of thoughts. Let's also talk about RAM prices in there as well. I think that we're already seeing, if you're talking about more budget-oriented stuff, prices are starting to filter down a little bit. I don't want to make it sound like they're suddenly crashing out there. They certainly are not. And we saw SSD prices in the last couple of years range from a low of like $40, $45 per terabyte. That's, of course, after the big hardware crash in like 2023, to something that I would expect kind of more normalized, about $60 per terabyte more recently. But right now, those same drives are going for $150 per terabyte for the more budget NVMEs. If you want something with a DRAM cache, it's $200 per terabyte, which sounds totally crazy. So my general advice this year has been, buy whatever you need to get through right now, because I do believe that the AI bubble is bursting in real time. And the first thing to go down will probably be SSD prices, not RAM prices. I know a lot of people want RAM prices to go down first. It's probably not going to happen. It's going to be the NVMe prices, because they're already making the NAND for that. Basically, they're already making the storage chips for it, and they're putting that in the servers. Well, as soon as those orders fall off, they're just going to take that supply, they're going to shove it back in a consumer. Unfortunately, on the RAM side, what we're seeing is that they're taking all the DRAM wafers and they're making them into HBM, high bandwidth memory. It actually takes a lot more wafers to make high bandwidth memory out of the silicon, than it does to make DDR4 or DDR5, the stuff that you and I are typically used to buying for a PC. So they're going to end up with these stockpiles of HBM memory that can't just be readily transferred over to DRAM. There's going to be a change in the manufacturing process in order to see those prices come down. So I believe SSD prices will come down before DRAM prices, and I do expect this to happen mid-2027. So right now, I say just stay in survival mode. You can consider buying used storage. It's not my favorite thing to do. It's something I've actually advised in the past not to do, because it's been one of the things that more often than not will fail down the line. You can buy used RAM, for instance, right now, especially DDR4 RAM. I'd feel fine buying used RAM, and I know you can get a pretty good deal. You can save like $50 basically buying used RAM versus new RAM on something like eBay. And the good thing about RAM is if it fails, it usually fails right away. And you can go ahead and use the eBay protection program or whatever to get your money back. Whereas SSDs, you might fail 3 or 4 months from now, and you might just be completely out of luck on that drive. Oftentimes because there's no warranty for it, and the protection period for whatever buying platform you use has already expired. So my recommendation is generally buy what you need to survive right now, both RAM and SSDs. And I believe mid-2027, you can always add on in the future. All right, Cryptic Bomba, channel member, by the way, you too can become a channel member. Click that join button after you subscribe. We do all kinds of fun things like live stream. We do live stream builds. We got a Discord. They want to know, with AMD and NVIDIA mostly dominating the CPU and GPU markets, do I think Intel can get into the mix more with future releases? What would it take for Intel to come back and save PC gaming? I think it's well within Intel's ability to be a major force. I think their biggest problem is they're addicted to these super high margins that I just don't know that in a pre-AI bubble crash environment they're going to get anymore. Same with AMD and NVIDIA, by the way. They have these super high margins, and I just don't know that they're going to see those margins. What do I mean by margins? I mean the amount of money that they're making versus what it costs them and what they can sell the product at. That's the gap right there. That's what they're really looking for. So in a post-AI bubble bursting world, I think they're going to have to accept smaller margins, and I think they've been unwilling to do that until recently. However, I think that they're just going to have to do it. And I think what they're doing with Arc Graphics on the handheld side is super exciting right now. I'm really excited to see if they come back to desktop, probably not with the current XE3 Celestial generation, but possibly with XE4 with the Druid generation, which honestly is probably closer than we think it is. It's probably a 2027 thing. Could we see Intel launch more desktop GPUs? I think that would be phenomenal. In the meantime, what they're doing with handheld graphics looks exciting. They're getting way better in terms of their overall GPU architecture. And I just think it bodes really, really good things to come. It took them a whole lot of time to get there, right? They've been working on GPUs since probably, mid-2010s, and then they didn't launch anything until 2022 on the desktop side, so we'll have to wait and see. In terms of the CPU market, I think Nova Lake looks pretty exciting later this year. I think X3D Nova Lake looks exciting, but more than anything, just getting it through their heads that they cannot do motherboard generations, motherboard sockets that only do 2 generations of CPUs and they're done. That mentality has finally hopefully been extinguished in Intel, and they realize they've got to go at least 4 generations. I think that's what consumers are demanding right now. They want 4 generations or more on a motherboard platform. Otherwise, they don't want it. They're just not interested. They want that future upgradability, and they're willing to pay the money for it. And we are getting charged, by the way, for that. We talk a lot about future upgradability with AM5 as though it's a benefit, and it is a benefit, but we're also paying a little bit of a price premium for it, oftentimes on the back end of the generation. So like pretty soon we're gonna get Zen 6. Well, if you buy a motherboard with Zen 6, you're only gonna get probably one more CPU upgrade on that. Oh, we'll have to wait and see, of course. But obviously we have AM6. At some point, we'll have AM6 kind of waiting in the wings. So I think then Intel will have an opportunity because they will now have a motherboard socket where you're going to have 3 more CPU generations to upgrade. And that will put them in an interesting position vis-a-vis AM5, where AMD is like, oh no, we've only got 1 more generation coming out after Zen 6. And Intel's going to be like, we've got 3 more. We've got our future upgradability over here now is worth a lot more. So I think they could turn the tables on AMD, but they would have to get aggressive, particularly in pricing. I'm just not sure that they're willing to do that. I thought they were going to do it with the 270K plus and the 250K plus, but then look, they've already raised the prices. They barely hit those prices. In fact, they really never hit those prices that they advertised. CPUs always sold for more, and they weren't that competitive, when you talk about price to performance, and that's where they needed to compete, was price to performance, because they didn't have an upgrade path to them. So hopefully they'll learn their lesson for Nova Lake and they're going to get ready for it, but we'll have to wait and see. All right. I don't know, man, maybe at what price point do you think AM5 is worth it? In their opinion, somewhere around $1,200 feels silly to spend that much or more on last gen on an upgradable platform. It's hard though with DDR prices still staying strong. Well, let me show you what I would recommend if you're looking to build a gaming PC in 2026 and for some reason you didn't build during Amazon Prime Day, but with an eye towards maybe Black Friday, maybe Amazon Prime Day in September, October, whenever they decide to bring it back. So here's the build I just did at Newegg. I call it the $900 Prime Day build. I did it obviously for Prime Day, but I just updated it. Basically, it says $986. Just note that the GPU discount does not appear in there. It's a $70 discount because right now you can get this for $399 for the 96XT 16 gigabyte. Over at Newegg, though I will note a couple of the models that had been offered with those discounts are gone. You can only find the XFX one right now. So if you want this GPU at $399, I likely would not wait for it, but we can take another $70 away from this price. So basically it's like a $900 build. And this uses a Ryzen 5500. And now we're also getting a free gaming mouse with this, a really nice motherboard that I've comboed here at Newegg. This is a tough B550-Plus motherboard I would not typically buy for a more budget build, but right now with a $30 combo offer, it's like $89. It's really hard to pass up, though it will necessitate us getting an ATX size case, so we are spending a little bit extra on the case too. I went with the Sama SVO2 on that. It's basically kind of a Montech XR style case I really like a lot. Then we went with relatively cheap PSU, great value. And I went with the 1 terabyte NVMe SSD. You can get the A-Data Legend right now for $130. That seems to make some sense. Yes, you can pick these up used, probably like, about $90 or something used. I would probably just spend the extra 30 bucks. That way my data is safe and I don't have to worry about it and it's got a warranty. And then of course for the RAM, I just went with one of the cheaper kits. You can actually get a cheaper kit right now for about $100 even over at Amazon, but still $115 is not bad for 16 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM, brand new. You can always buy used, of course. So this is the price point I would consider if I were building a new PC with mostly new parts and I had about $1,000, just under that, I'd be looking at AM4. Now let's contrast that to an AM5 build that you can do right now, also over at Newegg. What essentially has changed about this build is the CPU, the motherboard, and the RAM. I'm basically going with similar components across the board, except I did go with a slightly cheaper case here in the Fantex XT-M3 because I'm not using that ATX size motherboard. I'm using a micro ATX one. I just use the Gigabyte B650M. It's fine. It's got Wi-Fi. It's $110. You can find some cheaper boards for about $100 if you want. I'm using the Ryzen 7500F. I don't know why this one is the only one that works in Newegg's PC Builder. There's actually a cheaper one you can get from Senitech. It's like $148, so it's a $10 difference. And then for the RAM, we're basically spending $210 on this kit. We get $40 off on promo code. It's RGB, it's 6000 CL38. It's a 16 gigabyte kit. If you add that together and remember to take away the $60 from the $1,183, it's about $1,120. So you can see it's about a $200 difference to go AM5. So I would really only do this with a higher end GPU. I think the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte is absolutely fine on AM4. I probably wouldn't go this direction unless I had a little bit extra money and I just couldn't for some reason stretch up to like $1,300 and get a more powerful GPU. Let me know your thoughts on all these topics down in the video description. Are you somebody who always buys the biggest, fastest GPU? Or are you somebody who always focuses on value in the mid-range? What kind of FPS targets are you looking for? Let me know down in the comments, especially about the new X3D CPUs coming out. What do you think about Intel saving gaming? If you got value out of this video, please give it a like. Of course, subscribe for more cool PC content. Like, did you see part 1? We looked at RTX 50 Super Series coming out. What does that mean in terms of PC hardware? Does that mean NVIDIA thinks that PC hardware is actually about to get cheaper, launching the Super Series? Check it out, and we'll catch you on the next one.